Sometimes the heart finds what it never knew it was searching for in the most impossible places. Sometimes salvation arrives dusty and desperate on a stolen horse during the hottest summer in California Territory's brief history. Ezra Coleman had been alone in the Sierra Nevada mountains for 2 years, and he'd convinced himself that solitude was mercy. No hearts to break, no souls to disappoint, no graves to dig with trembling hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Then Clara Mitchell collapsed at his creek bed, her horse lathered with sweat and foam, her dress torn from days of hard riding through unforgiving country. She was running from something powerful back in San Francisco, something that put steel in her spine and fire in her green eyes, even as exhaustion claimed her. As he lifted her unconscious form from the saddle, Ezra had no way of knowing that helping this woman would resurrect parts of himself he'd buried deeper than any gold vein. In these mountains, the folks down in Silver Creek called him touched, a man who'd let grief drive him mad enough to choose rocks and ravens over human company. What would possess a refined lady to seek refuge with someone the mining camps whispered about in hushed tones? The heat that summer of 1851 seemed to rise from the very bones of the earth itself, turning the Sierra Nevada into a furnace that tested every living thing's will to survive. Ezra Coleman felt it in the way his chickens panted in whatever shade they could find, how his vegetable garden wilted despite his careful irrigation from Whispering Pine Creek, and in the strange restlessness that had settled over the local Miwok tribe who normally moved through these mountains with the quiet confidence of people who belonged to the land. He'd been checking his fish traps in the early morning hours, hoping to beat the day's brutal heat when the thunder of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. In 2 years of mountain living, Ezra had learned to distinguish between the sounds that meant opportunity and those that spelled trouble. This desperate galloping spoke of pursuit and panic, of someone pushing a horse beyond its limits through terrain that could kill the unwary. His cabin sat hidden in a narrow valley that most travelers would miss entirely, concealed behind a screen of massive pines and accessible only through a gap in the rocks that looked like nothing more than a shadow unless you knew exactly where to look. It was this invisibility that had drawn him here after the chaos of the gold fields became too much noise for a man trying to forget the sound of dirt falling on small coffins. The horse that burst through the concealing trees was a fine bay mare, her coat dark with sweat, sides heaving like bellows, foam streaming from her mouth in a way that made Ezra's stomach clench with anger at whoever had driven such a beautiful animal to near collapse. But it was the rider that stopped his breath entirely. She was slumped forward over the mare's neck, barely conscious. Her dark hair escaped from what had once been a proper arrangement and now hung in tangled waves around a face that even exhaustion couldn't rob of its striking beauty. Her traveling dress, once fine blue wool suitable for a lady of means, was now torn at the sleeves and stained with dust and sweat. More telling still were her hands, which gripped the reins with the desperate strength of someone who knew that letting go meant death. The mare stumbled as she reached the creek's edge, and her rider finally lost the battle to stay mounted, sliding sideways from the saddle with a soft cry that spoke of complete physical collapse. Ezra was moving before conscious thought caught up with instinct, catching the woman before she could hit the rocky ground, feeling the alarming heat of fever through her clothes and the way she seemed to weigh nothing at all in his arms. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 22 or 23, with the kind of refined features that spoke of good breeding and careful upbringing. But there was something else too, a stubborn set to her jaw even in unconsciousness, that suggested this was a woman who'd learned to fight for what she believed in. Her skin was flushed with heat stroke and dehydration, her breathing rapid and shallow in a way that told him she'd pushed herself as mercilessly as she had her horse. The mare stood with her head hanging nearly to the ground, trembling with exhaustion. A quick examination showed she was sound but desperately in need of water and rest. Someone had ridden this animal through hell itself, and the only reason that made sense was that whatever they were running from was worse than killing. A good horse. Ezra carried the unconscious woman toward his cabin, noting details that painted an increasingly troubling picture. Her boots were expensive leather, now scuffed and worn through in places from walking as well as riding. The tears in her dress looked deliberate, as if someone had grabbed at her and she'd fought free. Most telling of all was the small leather bag tied securely around her waist beneath her skirts. Its weight and the way she protected it, even in unconsciousness, suggesting it contained something valuable enough to risk everything for. Inside the cabin, he laid her on his narrow bed and began the careful process of treating heat exhaustion and dehydration. The preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. First priority was cooling her down without shocking her system. So he brought in cool water from the deepest part of the creek and began bathing her face and wrists with gentle strokes. Her fever was dangerous, high enough to muddle thinking and potentially cause lasting harm if not brought down quickly. As he worked, she mumbled words he couldn't quite catch, fragments of sentences that spoke of desperation and determination. Father's treasure was one phrase that emerged clearly, along with never find it, and once, in a voice so broken it made his chest tight. Won't go back, won't go back. Whatever had driven her to his hidden valley had been pursuing her for days, maybe weeks, and she'd reached the absolute end of her endurance. The cabin where Ezra had made his solitary home for 2 years was simple but well-constructed, built into the hillside to take advantage of natural cooling and positioned to catch the morning breeze that flowed down from the high peaks. He'd chosen this spot not just for its concealment, but for its practical advantages: fresh water year-round, good hunting, and soil rich enough for a garden that supplemented his diet of fish and wild game. The furnishings were sparse but functional, crafted by his own hands from pine and oak during the long winter evenings when work outside was impossible. A single room served as kitchen, sitting area, and bedroom, with a stone fireplace that provided heat for cooking and warmth during the brief mountain winter. It wasn't much by the standards of the world he'd left behind in Boston, but it represented something precious to him, a place where he could exist without pretense or expectation, where the only demands were those of survival and the changing seasons. He'd built this life deliberately, carefully, choosing isolation over the chaos of the mining camps where men killed each other over claims and poker games, where the desperate hunger for gold drove decent people to acts that would have shamed them in their former lives. After watching what greed and desperation could do to human souls, after losing everything that had ever mattered to him, the silence of the mountains had felt like sanctuary. The woman on his bed stirred restlessly as her fever began to break, and Ezra found himself studying her face with an attention that surprised him. It had been so long since he'd looked at another human being with anything beyond wary assessment that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be curious about someone's story, to wonder about the experiences that had shaped the lines around their eyes and the set of their mouth. She was beautiful, but it was a beauty that spoke of strength rather than mere prettiness. Her hands, when he checked them for injury, were soft but showed calluses that suggested she wasn't afraid of work. There was something about her that reminded him of the women he'd known back east, educated and refined, but with an underlying toughness that the frontier demanded of everyone who survived it. As the afternoon heat reached its peak, and even his shaded cabin grew uncomfortably warm, she finally opened her eyes. They were the deep green of pine needles and shadow, and they fixed on his face with an alertness that surprised him given how close to complete collapse she'd been just hours before. "You're safe," he said quickly, seeing the panic that flashed across her features as she took in her surroundings. "You collapsed by my creek. Your horse too. You've been fevered, but it's breaking now." She tried to sit up and immediately pressed a hand to her head, wincing at what was undoubtedly a fierce headache. "How long?" Her voice was hoarse from thirst and exhaustion, but he could hear the refinement in it, the careful diction of someone who'd been educated beyond the common standard. "Most of the day. Sun's past its peak now." He moved to pour water from the pitcher he kept on his small table, offering it to her with the careful movements of someone accustomed to dealing with wild creatures that might bolt at any sudden gesture. "Drink slow. Your body needs time to remember how." She accepted the water gratefully, but with a wariness that told him she'd learned not to trust easily. As she sipped, her eyes moved around the cabin, taking in the neat organization, the books on the single shelf, the quality of the craftsmanship in the furniture. He could almost see her adjusting her assessment of him, realizing that whoever he wasn't the wild hermit his appearance might suggest. "Thank you," she said finally, and there was genuine gratitude in her voice along with something else, relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. "I wasn't sure I'd make it much further. Where were you headed?" The question came, out more gently than he'd intended. But something about her vulnerability in that moment stripped away the careful distance he'd maintained from human connection for so long. Her face shuddered immediately, the openness disappearing behind a mask of careful neutrality. "Away," she said simply. "Just away from where I was." It was an answer that told him everything and nothing, but he recognized the tone. He'd heard it in his own voice often enough during those first months in the mountains when well-meaning traders or lost travelers had asked about his past. Some stories were too painful to tell to strangers, and some secrets were too dangerous to share with anyone at all. "Well, you're safe here," he said, settling back in his chair and giving her space to breathe. "At least until you and your horse are strong enough to travel again. She's in rough shape, by the way. Whoever was chasing you, you ran her pretty near to death getting away from them." The flash of guilt that crossed her face told him his guess about pursuit was accurate, and the way she touched the bag at her waist suggested she knew exactly why someone might be following her. But she didn't offer any explanation, and he didn't push for one. In his experience, people told you what you needed to know when they were ready, and forcing the issue usually ended with someone getting hurt. "I can pay you," she said suddenly, her chin lifting with a pride that spoke of someone unaccustomed to accepting charity. "For your help, for the feed for my horse. I'm not asking for something for nothing." There was something almost heartbreaking about the way she said it, as if she'd learned to expect that every kindness came with a price, every helping hand had strings attached. It made him wonder what kind of life she'd been living that had taught her to be so wary of simple human decency. "No payment necessary," he said firmly. "Out here, we help each other when we can. That's how folks survive in country like this." She studied his face as if trying to determine whether he was telling the truth or simply setting a higher price than she'd expected to pay. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because some of the tension went out of her shoulders, and she allowed herself to sink back against the pillow he'd arranged for her. "What's your name?" she asked after a moment of silence that felt comfortable rather than awkward. "Ezra Coleman." He'd given up using his full name when he'd fled to the mountains, dropping the Benjamin that his mother had chosen and the family connections it represented. "And you?" "Clara," she said, and he noticed she didn't offer a surname. "Clara will do fine." The afternoon stretched between them in a way that felt surprisingly natural given that they were complete strangers. She dozed fitfully while he went about his usual tasks, checking on her horse and ensuring the mare had adequate water and feed, tending to his small garden, and preparing a simple meal of trout and wild greens that would be easy on a stomach that had been empty too long. As evening approached and the brutal heat began to ease, Clara felt strong enough to sit up properly and take notice of her surroundings with more attention to detail. She examined his books with obvious interest, recognizing titles that suggested an education far beyond what most mountain men possessed. She watched him move around the cabin with the efficient grace of someone who'd learned to manage a household alone, noting the careful organization and cleanliness that spoke of discipline and self-respect. "You're not what I expected," she said finally as he handed her a plate of food. "What did you expect?" He was curious despite himself about how she saw him. This woman who'd fled something terrible enough to risk death in the wilderness rather than face it. Someone rougher, I suppose. More. She gestured vaguely, searching for words that wouldn't give offense. The stories they tell about mountain men in San Francisco make them sound like wild things, barely human. San Francisco. So that's where she'd come from. Probably part of the growing community of merchants and businessmen who were getting rich off the miners' needs rather than digging for gold themselves. It was a world he'd visited briefly during his first months in California, long enough to know it was no place for a man trying to escape the complexities of civilization. "I suppose I am rough by some standards," he said, running a hand through hair that hadn't seen barber's shears in months. But a man doesn't stop being human just because he chooses solitude over society. Something in his tone must have told her that his choice of isolation had been deliberate rather than accidental. because she looked at him with new understanding. "What brought you up here, Ezra Coleman?" It was a fair question given that he'd offered her sanctuary without asking for her story, but it still caught him off guard. He'd grown so accustomed to deflecting curiosity about his past that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone ask with genuine interest rather than idle nosiness. "Same thing that brought you, I imagine," he said finally. "Sometimes running away is the only choice that makes sense." She nodded as if she understood exactly what he meant, and something passed between them in that moment. A recognition of shared pain, even if the specific details remained unspoken. They were both refugees from their former lives, both carrying wounds that had driven them to seek healing in the wilderness, and that understanding created a foundation of trust that surprised them both with its immediate strength. As full darkness settled over the valley and the temperature finally dropped to something bearable, Clara insisted on helping to clean up from their simple meal despite Ezra's protests that she needed to rest. There was something determined about the way she moved around his small space, as if she needed to prove to herself that she was still capable of normal domestic tasks, still the person she'd been before whatever had happened to drive her into the mountains. "Your horse should be fit to travel in a few days," Ezra said as they settled beside the open doorway to catch the evening breeze. "Assuming you still want to keep running." "I have to keep running," Clara said quietly, and there was steel in her voice that told him this wasn't a decision she'd made lightly. "There are people looking for me who won't give up easily, and staying in one place too long would be dangerous for both of us." The way she included him in the danger told him more about her character than a dozen direct explanations might have. She was someone who thought about consequences to others, who wouldn't put an innocent person at risk just to save herself. It was a quality that seemed increasingly rare in his experience of human nature, and it stirred something in his chest that he'd thought he'd successfully buried along with his capacity for caring about other people's welfare. "Where will you go?" he asked, though he suspected she might not have an answer beyond a way. "Oregon Territory, maybe. Somewhere I can disappear completely, start over with a new name and a new life." She touched the bag at her waist again, and he wondered what kind of resources she was carrying that made such a complete transformation seem possible. "What about you? Will you stay here forever?" The question caught him off guard because it implied a future he'd never really considered. His life in the mountains had been about surviving one day at a time, getting through the immediate pain of loss without thinking too far ahead. The idea that there might be other choices, other possibilities beyond simple endurance, was something he hadn't allowed himself to contemplate. "I hadn't thought much beyond staying alive and staying alone," he admitted. "This place has been peaceful enough for my needs." "Peaceful," Clara repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I can see how it would be. But don't you ever miss having someone to share it with? Someone to talk to about more than just the weather and the game trails?" The honest answer was that he'd been missing exactly that more acutely with each passing month, but he wasn't ready to admit it even to himself, much less to a woman he'd known for less than a day. Instead, he found himself studying her profile in the lamplight, noting the way exhaustion had softened the careful control she'd maintained over her expressions, making her seem younger and more vulnerable than the determined fugitive who'd collapsed at his creek. "Maybe," he said finally, "maybe I do miss that sometimes." It was a small admission, but it felt significant in the quiet of the evening, with the sounds of the wilderness settling around them and the comfortable intimacy of shared space making conversation feel safer than it had any right to between strangers. Clara turned to look at him, and he saw understanding in her eyes along with something else, a recognition that they might be more alike than either had initially supposed. "Thank you," she said again, but this time the gratitude encompassed more than just medical care and shelter. "For not asking questions I'm not ready to answer. For not making me feel like I owe you explanations along with payment." "Everyone's got a right to their secrets," Ezra said, "especially when sharing them might put other people in danger." The fact that she didn't contradict his assumption about danger told him his instincts about her situation were accurate, and it made him more curious than ever about what kind of trouble could drive a clearly educated and well-bred woman to risk everything on a desperate flight into the wilderness. But he held his questions, respecting the boundaries she'd established, and was rewarded by the gradual relaxation of her posture as she realized he wasn't going to press for details she wasn't ready to share. As the evening wore on and Clara's Exhaustion finally overcame her determination to stay alert. Ezra found himself watching over her sleep with a protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. Something about her had awakened feelings he'd thought were permanently buried, and he wasn't sure whether to be grateful for the reminder that he was still capable of caring about another person or terrified of the vulnerability that caring represented. Outside, the sounds of the mountain night surrounded his cabin with the familiar symphony of insects and small creatures going about their nocturnal business. But inside, everything felt different. The space that had been his refuge from human connection now held another person's presence, and instead of feeling like an invasion, it felt like a completion he hadn't known he needed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions about how to keep Clara safe until she was strong enough to continue her journey. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, Ezra Coleman fell asleep to the sound of another person's breathing, and his dreams were filled with possibilities he'd convinced himself were no longer meant for men like him. Part 2. The rescue and initial stakes. Dawn came early to the Sierra Nevada in summer, but the heat followed close behind, turning the mountain air thick and oppressive before most folks had finished their morning coffee. Ezra woke to find Clara already stirring, her fever completely broken, but her eyes holding the kind of wariness that spoke of someone who'd learned to assess danger before she was fully conscious. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly, not wanting to startle her in what was still, for all practical purposes, a stranger's home. "Better," she said, though he could hear the hoarseness that lingered in her voice. "Weak as a newborn calf, but better." She attempted to sit up and immediately pressed a hand to her temple, wincing at what was clearly still a fierce headache. "My horse, alive and eating," Ezra assured her, moving to pour fresh water from the pitcher he'd refilled at first light. "Though she's going to need at least another day or two before she's fit for anything more strenuous than a gentle walk to the creek." He watched Clara's face carefully as she processed this information, noting the way her jaw tightened with what might have been frustration or fear. Time was clearly important to her, more important than her own comfort or even her safety, which told him that whatever she was running from was still very much a threat. "They'll be tracking me," she said finally, confirming his suspicions. "Professional men, the kind who don't give up easily once they've been given a job." The casual way she mentioned professional trackers sent a chill down Ezra's spine. This wasn't some family dispute or romantic entanglement gone wrong. Clara was being pursued by people who made hunting fugitives their business, which meant she'd either done something serious enough to warrant such attention, or she possessed something valuable enough to justify the expense of hiring experts. "How far behind do you think they are?" he asked, automatically shifting into the kind of tactical thinking that had kept him alive during his brief stint as a volunteer marshal back in the early days of the gold rush. 2 days, maybe 3 if I'm lucky, and they lost time following false trails." Clara's matter-of-fact tone suggested she'd been calculating pursuit times and distances for longer than just this particular flight. "I tried to be clever about it, doubling back and crossing streams to confuse the scent for their dogs, but they're good at what they do." Dogs. That changed everything. Ezra had dealt with tracking dogs before, and he knew that no amount of cleverness could completely eliminate a scent trail if the animals were well-trained and their handlers persistent. The fact that her pursuers had brought dogs suggested they were either very serious about finding her or very well-funded, possibly both. What kind of dogs? The question was purely practical, but Clara looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to know that different breeds presented different challenges. "Bloodhounds, I think. Big ones, bred for endurance rather than speed." She rubbed her arms as if the memory of being hunted made her cold despite the growing heat of the day. "They had them on leads, following my trail like they'd done it 100 times before." Bloodhounds were serious business, the kind of advantage that professional bounty hunters used when they wanted to be absolutely certain they wouldn't lose their quarry. The fact that Clara knew enough to distinguish between breeds told Ezra that she'd either seen them in action before or had learned about tracking methods from someone who understood the business of pursuit and capture. "Well then," he said, standing and moving toward the cabin's single window to scan the valley below for any signs of movement, "we'd better make sure you're long gone before they get close enough to pick up a fresh trail." The "we" slipped out before he'd consciously decided to involve himself in Clara's troubles, but once the word was spoken, he found he didn't want to take it back. Something about this woman had engaged his protective instincts in a way that surprised him with its intensity, making him want to stand between her and whatever forces were pursuing her through the wilderness. Clara stared at him with obvious confusion, as if she couldn't quite believe what she'd heard. "You don't even know what they want me for," she said carefully. "For all you know, I could be a murderess or a thief, someone who deserves to be dragged back to face justice. Are you?" The question was direct, but Ezra asked it without judgment, genuinely curious about her answer rather than trying to trap her into some kind of confession. "No," Clara said firmly, and the absolute certainty in her voice convinced him more than any elaborate explanation might have. "I'm not a murderess or a thief, though I suppose the men chasing me might claim otherwise if it suited their purposes." The careful phrasing told him that her situation was complicated, involving legal or financial matters that could be interpreted different ways depending on who was doing the interpreting. It was exactly the kind of murky circumstance that the rough justice of the frontier often failed to handle fairly, especially when one side had significantly more resources than the other. "Then that's all I need to know," Ezra said simply. "Whatever brought those men after you, they're not going to find you while you're under my protection." The word protection seemed to hit Clara like a physical blow, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing the fear and exhaustion she'd been holding at bay through sheer force of will. When was the last time someone had offered her protection without expecting something in return? When was the last time she'd felt safe enough to let her guard down even for a moment? "You don't understand what you're offering," she said quietly. "These aren't just local men with a grudge. They have connections, resources, the kind of backing that can make life very difficult for anyone who gets in their way." Ezra studied her face, noting the way she spoke about her pursuers with the kind of intimate knowledge that came from personal experience rather than speculation. She knew these men, or at least knew the type, which suggested her flight wasn't the desperate impulse of someone caught off guard, but the carefully planned escape of someone who'd understood exactly what she was up against. "I've dealt with men like that before," he said, though he didn't elaborate on the circumstances that had given him such experience. "They might have resources and connections, but they're still just men, and men can be stopped if you know how." Something in his tone must have convinced Clara that he wasn't just making empty promises, because she looked at him with new attention, reassessing him the same way she'd done when she'd first noticed the quality of his books and furniture. Who was Ezra Coleman really, and what kind of past had equipped him to speak so confidently about stopping dangerous men with powerful backing? The morning heat was already becoming oppressive despite the early hour, and Ezra knew they'd need to make any necessary preparations before the sun reached its peak and made outside work nearly impossible. The fact that Clara's pursuers were traveling with dogs meant they couldn't simply rely on the natural concealment of his hidden valley. They'd need to actively obscure any traces of her presence and create false trails that would lead the hunters away from his sanctuary. "Can you ride?" he asked, moving toward the small wooden chest where he kept his more valuable possessions. "Not far or fast, but enough to help me lay down some false trails that might buy us more time." "I can ride," Clara said, though he could hear the uncertainty in her voice about her current physical condition. "But I thought you said my horse needed more time to recover." "Your horse does," Ezra agreed, pulling a worn leather map from the chest and spreading it on his small table. "But I've got a mule that's steadier and stronger, better suited for the kind of work we need to do." The map showed the local area in detail that spoke of years of careful exploration and notation. Every creek, game trail, and potential camping spot was marked in different colored inks, creating a resource that would be invaluable to anyone trying to navigate the complex terrain of the Sierra Nevada foothills. It was the kind of map that took years to create and represented knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death in country where a wrong turn could lead to a dead-end canyon or an impassable cliff face. Clara leaned forward to study the map, and Ezra noticed that she read it with the kind of competence that suggested familiarity with navigation and terrain assessment. Most women of her apparent social class would have been completely lost trying to interpret topographical markings and elevation indicators, but she traced potential routes with her finger as if she'd been reading such maps for years. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, genuinely curious about this unexpected skill. "My father," Clara said simply, and for the first time since he'd found her, a genuine smile touched her lips. He was a ship's captain before he died, and he believed that anyone who might need to find their way in the world should understand how to read both sea charts and land maps. A ship's captain. That explained her familiarity with navigation and possibly her comfortable assumption that she could disappear completely by traveling to distant territories. It also suggested that her family had possessed, at least moderate, wealth and social standing, which made her current desperate circumstances all the more intriguing. Smart man, Ezra said, returning his attention to the map. Most folks underestimate how easy it is to get lost and die if you don't understand the country you're traveling through. He began pointing out potential routes that her pursuers might take when they reached this area, explaining how the terrain would funnel them towards certain approaches while making others nearly impossible. Clara listened with the kind of focused attention that told him she understood not just the immediate tactical situation, but the broader implications of being hunted through wilderness by professionals who knew their business. Here's what we're going to do, Ezra said, tracing a complex pattern on the map with his finger. We'll take my mule and ride about 3 miles north, following the main creek bed where the water will help mask our scent. Then we'll split up, you heading west toward that old mining camp, while I continue north toward the high pass. Split up? Clara's voice was sharp with alarm. But you said you'd protect me. I will protect you, Ezra assured her firmly. That's exactly what I'm doing. When the dogs reach the point where we separated, they'll have 2 trails to follow. Professional hunters will split their force to cover both possibilities, which means the group following you will be smaller and easier to evade. The plan was tactically sound, but Clara was shaking her head before he'd finished explaining it. You don't understand. If they catch you, they'll make you tell them which trail is the real one. These aren't the kind of men who ask questions politely. The concern in her voice touched something deep in Ezra's chest, a warmth he hadn't felt since before his world had collapsed back in Boston. When was the last time anyone had worried about his safety? When was the last time someone had looked at him with genuine fear for his welfare rather than calculating what he might be worth to them? They won't catch me, he said quietly, and there was something in his tone that made Clara look at him with sharp attention. I know these mountains better than any outsider ever could, and I've dealt with men who thought they could intimidate answers out of folks before. Again, Clara seemed to hear something in his voice that suggested experiences he wasn't ready to share, but she didn't push for details. Instead, she studied his face as if trying to determine whether his confidence was justified or merely the bravado of someone who didn't understand what he was up against. What happens after we lay the false trails? She asked finally. Where do I go while you're leading them on a chase through the high country? Ezra pointed to a spot on the map about 15 miles southeast of his cabin, where a tributary creek joined the main waterway near an abandoned mining operation. There's an old stamp mill there, been closed down for 6 months since the vein played out. The buildings are still sound, and there's fresh water and decent grazing for the horses. You want me to hide in an abandoned mine? Clara's skepticism was obvious, and Ezra couldn't blame her for it. Abandoned mining camps were often dangerous places, unstable structures, and poison water sources that could kill the unwary as efficiently as any human pursuer. Not in the mine, he clarified quickly. In the mill foreman's house, about a quarter-mile downstream from the main workings. It's built solid, easily defended, and positioned where you can see anyone approaching from 3 different directions. He'd discovered the location during his first winter in the mountains, when he'd been exploring every potential shelter and resource within a day's travel of his chosen valley. The house had been constructed by someone who understood both the practical needs of frontier living and the very real possibility of Indian attacks or claim jumpers, resulting in a structure that was part home and part fortress. How long do I wait there? Clara was studying the map again, tracing the route from Ezra's cabin to the abandoned mill with her finger. And how do I know whether you're coming back or whether I should assume something's gone wrong? The practical nature of her questions told Ezra that Clara had learned to think like someone whose survival depended on having backup plans for every contingency. She wasn't just accepting his protection blindly. She was thinking through all the ways the plan could go wrong and preparing herself to act independently if necessary. Give me 4 days, he said after considering the distances and terrain involved. If I'm not at the mill house by sunset on the 4th day, Assume I'm not coming and head for Oregon on your own." For days seemed like an eternity when he thought about leaving Clara alone in hostile territory with professional hunters somewhere in the area, but it was the minimum amount of time he'd need to lead any pursuit far enough away to ensure her safety. The high country was treacherous enough that even experienced trackers could be delayed by weather or terrain, giving him opportunities to lose them completely if he was clever about it. What about supplies? Clara was thinking through the logistics with the same methodical approach she'd applied to reading his map. Food, ammunition, medical supplies in case something goes wrong. Her assumption that he'd be armed and prepared for violence told Ezra that Clara understood exactly what kind of men were pursuing her and what they were likely to do if they caught either of them. It was a sobering reminder that this wasn't some romantic adventure, but a deadly serious game where mistakes would be paid for with lives. "I'll pack everything you'll need," he assured her. "Food for a week, basic medical supplies, and a rifle with plenty of ammunition. The house has a good well and a root cellar that should still have some preserved goods from when the mine was operating." The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made both of them freeze in alarm. In the distance, almost at the edge of hearing, came the distinctive baying of hounds on a scent trail. The sound was still far away, probably several miles down the main valley, but it was clearly moving in their direction with the steady persistence that spoke of dogs who'd found what they were looking for. Clara went white at the sound, her hand instinctively moving to the bag at her waist, as if to reassure herself that whatever it contained was still secure. The terror that flashed across her face told Ezra more about what she'd endured during her flight than any verbal description could have managed. "They're closer than I thought," she whispered, and her voice was tight with the kind of fear that came from intimate knowledge of what capture would mean. They must have traveled through the night. Ezra was already moving, gathering supplies, with the quick efficiency of someone who'd learned to break camp under pressure. The luxury of careful planning was gone now, replaced by the immediate necessity of getting Clara away from his cabin before the hunters could establish a fresh trail leading directly to her location. "Can you travel now?" he asked, stuffing jerky and hardtack into a canvas bag while keeping one ear tuned to the distant sound of the dogs. "Not comfortably, but travel?" "I can travel," Clara said firmly, and despite her obvious fear, there was steel in her voice that told him she'd push herself beyond exhaustion again if that's what survival required. "What about the false trails?" "No time for elaborate deceptions now," Ezra admitted, hauling his saddle toward the door. "We'll have to settle for getting you away from here and hope the terrain gives us enough advantages to make up for the head start we've lost." As they prepared to leave the cabin that had been Ezra's sanctuary for 2 years, he found himself looking around the small space with the kind of attention that came from knowing he might never see it again. Everything here represented his attempt to build a life of peace and solitude. But now that refuge was about to be shattered by the violence that seemed to follow him no matter how far he ran. Clara seemed to understand what the moment meant to him, because she touched his arm gently as he stood in the doorway with his pack on his shoulders. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I never meant to bring trouble to someone who'd been kind to me." "Trouble has a way of finding folks whether they invite it or not," Ezra replied, though he was surprised to discover that he felt no resentment about leaving his mountain sanctuary. "The only question is whether you face it alone or with someone standing beside you." The baying of the hounds was definitely closer now, and there was no more time for regrets or second thoughts. Clara's flight had become their flight, and whatever happened next, they would face it together. As they led the mule and Clara's recovering mare toward the concealed trail that would take them away from the hidden valley, Ezra found himself wondering if this was how his life was meant to unfold, not in peaceful isolation, but in the kind of partnership that made both danger and survival more meaningful than either could be alone. Part 3. Hidden Identity revealed the trail away from Ezra's hidden valley wound through terrain that seemed designed by nature to challenge anyone foolish enough to attempt passage on horseback. Massive granite boulders created a maze of narrow passages where a single misstep could send horse and rider tumbling into crevices that disappeared into darkness, while twisted manzanita bushes clawed at clothing and skin with thorns sharp enough to draw blood through leather. Clara rode Ezra's mule with the kind of grim determination that spoke of someone pushing past physical limits through sheer force of will. Her face was pale with exhaustion and pain, but she never complained or asked for rest, understanding that. The distant sound of the tracking dogs left no room for comfort or consideration of anything beyond immediate survival. Ezra led the way on foot, guiding Clara's mare behind him while keeping one ear tuned to the sounds of pursuit. The dogs were definitely following their trail now, their voices carrying clearly through the mountain air with the steady persistence. That told him their handlers were experienced professionals who knew how to pace their animals for maximum endurance rather than speed. "How much farther to where we separate?" Clara asked quietly, her voice tight with the effort of staying upright in the saddle despite her weakened condition. "Another mile, maybe less," Ezra replied, though he was beginning to have serious doubts about the wisdom of splitting up when Clara was in no condition to handle a solo flight through dangerous territory. "There's a creek crossing ahead where the water runs deep enough to give the dogs some trouble." The plan that had seemed tactically sound back in the safety of his cabin now felt like pure foolishness when he looked at Clara's exhausted face and considered what would happen if she encountered any of the 100 different dangers that could kill a lone traveler in the Sierra Nevada. Bears, mountain lions, rattlesnakes, flash floods, simple falls from tired horses. All of these posed threats that would be manageable with two people but potentially fatal for someone traveling alone. "You're reconsidering the plan," Clara observed, and there was something almost like relief in her voice. "I can see it in your face." Ezra glanced back at her, surprised by her perceptiveness. "You're in no condition to be riding alone through country like this," he admitted. "If something happened to you after I'd sent you off on your own, I'd never forgive myself. And if something happens to you because you stayed with me instead of leading them away on a false trail, I'd never forgive myself either," Clara countered. "We can't protect each other from every possible danger, Ezra. Sometimes the best you can do is trust the other person to be strong enough to handle what comes next." There was wisdom in her words, but also a weariness that spoke of someone who'd been forced to rely on her own strength for longer than should have been necessary. How many times had Clara faced dangers alone because there was no one else to depend on? How many times had she been forced to choose between bad options because there were no good ones available? The creek crossing appeared ahead of them exactly where Ezra's mental map had predicted, a narrow stream that tumbled down from the high country in a series of small waterfalls and deep pools carved into the granite bedrock. The water was crystal clear and cold enough to numb exposed skin within seconds, fed by snowmelt from peaks that never completely lost their white crowns even in the heat of summer. Ezra led both animals into the stream, noting how the mules' hooves clicked against the smooth stone bottom, while Clara's mare snorted at the shock of cold water against her legs. This was where they would have to make their choice: continue together and hope they could stay ahead of pursuit, or split up and trust that each could survive whatever challenges awaited them on their separate paths. "Listen to me," Clara said, suddenly, her voice urgent with the need to say something before they reached the point of no return. "There are things about my situation that you don't understand. Things that make this more complicated than just helping a woman escape from men who want to drag her back where she doesn't want to go." Ezra halted in the middle of the stream, cold water swirling around his boots while he waited for Clara to continue. The tone of her voice suggested that whatever she was about to tell him would change everything about how he understood her circumstances, and he found himself both eager and apprehensive about what he might learn. "The men chasing me aren't just hired trackers," Clara continued, her words coming in a rush as if she'd been holding them back for too long. "They're working for Vincent Blackwood, who owns half the shipping business in San Francisco and has connections with politicians and judges all the way back to Washington." Vincent Blackwood. The name meant nothing to Ezra personally, but the way Clara spoke, it suggested someone with the kind of wealth and influence that could make laws bend to suit his convenience. In the rough democracy of the frontier, such men were often more powerful than elected officials, able to buy justice and protection for themselves while destroying anyone who stood in their way. "What does Blackwood want with you?" Ezra asked, though he suspected the answer would involve either money or revenge, the two motivations that drove most powerful men to extreme measures. "He wants his property back," Clara said bitterly. $3,000 in gold coins that belonged to my father, and the woman he paid good money to acquire as his wife." The casual way she referred to herself as property that had been purchased told Ezra more about Vincent Blackwood's character than any detailed description could have managed. This wasn't just about recovering stolen money. It was about a man who viewed other human beings as possessions to be bought, owned, and controlled according to his desires. Your father's gold, Ezra said, understanding beginning to dawn. That's what you're carrying in that bag. Clara nodded, her hand moving instinctively to protect the leather pouch that had never left her side since he'd found her. Papa hid it before he died, told me where to find it, but made me promise never to let Blackwood get his hands on it. He said it was my inheritance, my guarantee of independence if I ever needed to escape from the life that had been planned for me. The pieces of her story were beginning to fit together in a way that painted a picture of systematic exploitation and control. A ship captain's daughter, probably orphaned young, and left in the care of people who saw her more as a valuable asset than a human being worthy of protection and consideration. An arranged marriage to a man who viewed women as property to be acquired and managed. A desperate flight with stolen resources that represented her only chance of freedom. And the marriage? Ezra asked gently, though he suspected this part of the story would be even more difficult for Clara to discuss. Arranged by my guardian after Papa died, Clara said, and her voice took on the flat tone of someone reciting facts too painful for emotional engagement. Vincent Blackwood needed a wife with the right social connections to improve his standing in San Francisco society, and my guardian needed to pay off gambling debts that would have landed him in prison if they weren't settled quickly. It was a sordid but common enough story in a society where women had few legal rights and fewer options for independence. Clara had been traded like a commodity to satisfy the financial and social ambitions of men who viewed her primarily as a means to their own ends, with no consideration for her own desires or welfare. So you took your inheritance and ran rather than go through with a marriage that would have given Blackwood legal control over both you and your father's money, Ezra said, and there was admiration in his voice for the courage such a choice must have required. I tried to make the best of it at first, Clara admitted. Vincent can be charming when he wants something, and I told myself that maybe marriage to him wouldn't be so terrible. But then I saw how he treated his servants, his business partners, anyone who couldn't fight back or protect themselves. The way her voice trailed off told Ezra that there were specific incidents she wasn't ready to discuss. Moments that had shown her exactly what kind of man Vincent Blackwood really was beneath his civilized exterior. He could imagine the kind of casual cruelty that powerful men often displayed toward those they considered beneath their notice, and he understood why Clara had chosen to risk death in the wilderness rather than submit to a lifetime of such treatment. When did you realize you had to run? He asked, keeping his voice gentle and non-judgmental. The night before our wedding, Clara said, and now her voice was barely above a whisper. He'd been drinking with his friends, celebrating what he called his acquisition of a pretty young wife and her father's hidden treasure. They didn't know I could hear them, but Vincent was explaining how he planned to handle me once we were married. How wives needed to be broken like horses if they showed too much spirit. The cold anger that swept through Ezra at her words surprised him with its intensity. He'd thought he'd learned to accept the casual injustices of the world with the kind of resigned indifference that came from seeing too much human cruelty. But something about Clara's situation had awakened protective instincts he'd assumed were buried along with his capacity for caring about other people's welfare. So you took the gold and left, he said, struggling to keep his voice level. I waited until they were all too drunk to notice, gathered what I could carry, and slipped out of the house like a thief in the night, Clara confirmed. Though I suppose that's exactly what Vincent will claim I am when he tells people his version of the story. It was a brilliant but desperate move that required exactly the kind of courage and determination Clara had displayed in her flight through the mountains. Most women in her situation would have resigned themselves to their fate, accepting marriage to a cruel man as the price of financial security and social acceptance. The fact that she'd chosen freedom over safety spoke to a strength of character that Ezra found himself deeply admiring. How long ago was that? He asked, trying to calculate how much of a head start she'd managed to gain. 2 weeks, Clara said. I've been traveling constantly, changing horses when I could, sleeping rough when I had to, always staying ahead of the search parties Vincent sent after me. 2 weeks of constant flight through some of the most dangerous territory in North America, pursued by professional trackers with virtually unlimited resources. The fact that Clara had survived such an ordeal spoke not just to her determination, but to skills and knowledge that most women of her social class would never have had reason to develop. Your father taught you more than just map reading, Ezra observed, and Clara managed a weak smile despite their dire circumstances. Papa believed that anyone who might need to survive on their own should know how to do it properly, she said. Basic medical care, how to evaluate horses, which plants were safe to eat and which would poison you, how to make a fire in wet conditions, how to tell direction by the stars when you don't have a compass. Captain Mitchell had clearly been a man who understood the realities of life in a world where circumstances could change quickly and dramatically. By teaching his daughter such skills, he'd given her the tools she needed to survive the kind of desperate flight she was now making, though he probably never imagined she'd need to use them to escape from the very people who should have been protecting her. The sound of baying dogs was definitely closer now, close enough that Ezra could distinguish individual voices in the pack. Professional trackers usually worked with teams of 3 or 4 animals, enough to follow multiple trails if necessary, but not so many that they became difficult to manage in rough terrain. Decision time, he said grimly, looking at Clara's exhausted face and weighing their increasingly limited options. We can still split up and hope that dividing their attention gives us both a better chance, or we can stay together and try to outrun them through country where I have the advantage of local knowledge. Clara was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to read something in his expression that would help her make the right choice. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. If we stay together and they catch us both, Vincent gets everything he wants, she said practically. If we split up and they catch only one of us, at least the other has a chance to get away. It was a coldly logical assessment of their tactical situation, but Ezra found himself rebelling against the idea of abandoning Clara to face pursuit alone while he led the rest of the hunting party on a chase through the high country. The protective instincts she'd awakened in him demanded that he stay close enough to help if she encountered trouble, even if that decision reduced both their chances of survival. There's another option, he said slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind as he studied the terrain around the creek crossing. Something that might give us the advantages of splitting up without actually separating. Clara looked at him with sharp attention, clearly hoping for a solution that would address the tactical necessities without requiring them to face their dangers alone. What are you thinking? The hunters will expect us to follow obvious routes, Ezra explained, pointing toward a game trail that wound up the hillside toward what appeared to be easier traveling. They'll send their main force that way while leaving a smaller group to check less likely possibilities. He indicated a narrow crack in the granite cliffs that looked like nothing more than a shadow unless you knew exactly where to look. That leads to a passage that connects with a whole network of caves and hidden valleys. It's dangerous, easy to get lost or trapped if you don't know the way, but it would let us move parallel to the main hunting party without being seen. The plan was risky in entirely different ways than splitting up, requiring them to navigate treacherous terrain in near darkness while staying close enough to their pursuers to monitor their movements without being detected. But it would allow them to stay together while still gaining the tactical advantages that came from taking an unexpected route. You've used that passage before? Clara asked, studying the crack in the cliff face with the kind of attention that suggested she was already calculating the risks and benefits of the proposed route. Once, when I was first exploring the area, Ezra admitted. It's not a journey I'd want to make again under normal circumstances, but normal circumstances don't include being hunted by professionals with trained dogs. The sound of the tracking pack was close enough now that they could hear the voices of the handlers calling encouragement to their animals. Time for discussion was running out rapidly, and whatever choice they made would have to be implemented immediately if they hoped to avoid detection. Clara straightened in her saddle, and despite her exhaustion, there was determination in her voice when she spoke. Then that's what we'll do, she said firmly. Together. The simple word carried more weight than any elaborate declaration could have managed, representing not just a tactical decision, but a commitment to face whatever came next as partners rather than as two separate individuals trying to survive on their own. As they guided their animals toward the concealed entrance to the underground passage, Ezra found himself thinking that this might be the first time in his life that running away felt like the beginning of something important rather than just the end of something that had failed. Part 4. The vulnerable moment and first care. The passage through the granite cliffs proved to be every bit as treacherous as Ezra had remembered, forcing them to dismount and lead their animals through sections where the stone walls pressed so close together that the packs scraped against both sides simultaneously. The darkness was absolute once they moved beyond the reach of sunlight, broken only by the occasional shaft of illumination that filtered down through cracks in the rock ceiling far above their heads. Clara's breathing became increasingly labored as they made their way deeper into the underground maze, and Ezra could hear the exhaustion in every step she took across the uneven stone floor. She was pushing herself far beyond what her weakened condition should have allowed, driven by the knowledge that stopping now would mean capture by the men who were undoubtedly searching the more obvious routes above ground. "How much farther?" she asked quietly, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Hard to say in the dark," Ezra admitted, though he was beginning to recognize landmarks that suggested they were approaching the section where the passage opened into a larger cave system. "But we should reach a place where we can rest soon." The promise of rest seemed to be all that was keeping Clara moving forward, and Ezra found himself watching her carefully for signs that she was about to collapse. The fever had broken, but her body was still recovering from the severe dehydration and heat exhaustion that had nearly killed her, and the stress of their desperate flight was taking a toll that she couldn't afford to pay much longer. When they finally emerged into a cavern large enough for them to stand upright without fear of hitting their heads on stone projections, Clara immediately sank down onto a flat boulder and buried her face in her hands. The small sound she made might have been a sob or simply the release of breath she'd been holding too long, but either way it spoke of someone who had reached the absolute limit of her endurance. "Hey," Ezra said gently, settling beside her on the boulder while keeping his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the passage they'd just exited. "You're doing fine. We're safe here for a while." "I don't feel safe," Clara whispered, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I don't think I've felt safe since the night I ran away from Vincent's house, and I'm starting to wonder if I ever will again." The admission seemed to cost her something, as if acknowledging her fear made it more real and therefore more dangerous. Ezra understood the feeling, having spent months after his own flight from Boston convinced that safety was just an illusion that would be shattered the moment he allowed himself to believe in it. "Safety isn't a place," he said quietly, surprising himself with the wisdom in his own words. "It's a feeling you carry inside you when you know someone else is watching your back." Clara studied his face in the dim light that filtered down from somewhere high above them, and he could see her trying to decide whether to trust what he was offering. How long had it been since anyone had made her feel genuinely protected rather than simply used for their own purposes? "Why are you helping me?" she asked suddenly. "You don't know me, don't owe me anything. For all you know, I really could be everything Vincent claims I am." It was a fair question, one that Ezra had been asking himself since he'd first decided to offer Clara his protection. The honest answer was complicated, involving instincts and emotions he wasn't entirely comfortable examining too closely, but she deserved something more substantial than vague reassurances about frontier hospitality. "Because I know what it's like to run from something that feels bigger and more powerful than you are," he said finally. "Because I recognize the look in your eyes when you talk about the men chasing you. And because sometimes helping someone else is the only way to prove to yourself that you're still human." The last part slipped out before he'd consciously decided to share it, revealing more about his own emotional state than he'd intended. But Clara seemed to understand that he'd offered her something precious, a glimpse into wounds that were still healing beneath his carefully maintained exterior. "What were you running from?" she asked softly, and there was genuine concern in her voice rather than mere curiosity. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, listening to the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the depths of the cave system, while he considered how much of his story he was ready to share. Clara had trusted him with the truth about her circumstances, and fairness suggested that he owe her the same honesty about his own past. "Cholera took my wife and daughter in the summer of '49, he said finally, the words coming out flat and emotionless as they always did when he forced himself to speak about Sarah and little Emma. I was working as a banker in Boston. Thought I had everything figured out. Thought money and respectability were enough to protect the people I loved. Clara made a small sound of sympathy, understanding immediately that this wasn't just about personal loss, but about the complete collapse of everything he believed about how the world worked. "I'm sorry," she said simply, and the genuine compassion in her voice made something tight in his chest loosen slightly. "I tried to go back to work, tried to pretend that nothing had changed, but everything reminded me of what I'd lost," Ezra continued, surprised by how much easier it was to talk about this with Clara than it had ever been with anyone else. The house where we'd been happy, the bank where I'd worked to provide for them, even the church where we'd planned to watch Emma grow up and get married someday. He could see Clara imagining the life he'd described, understanding how completely such losses would have shattered not just his happiness, but his entire sense of purpose and identity. When everything you'd worked for disappeared in a matter of days, what reason did you have to continue playing the role you'd built for yourself? "So you came west," Clara said, and it wasn't a question. "So I came west," Ezra confirmed. "Figured if I was going to be miserable anyway, I might as well be miserable somewhere that didn't constantly remind me of what I'd lost." The gold rush was just getting started, and California seemed like a place where a man could disappear completely if that's what he wanted. "But you didn't stay in the gold fields," Clara observed, clearly trying to understand how he'd ended up alone in a hidden mountain valley rather than in one of the booming mining camps that dotted the Sierra Nevada foothills. "Tried it for a few months," Ezra said, remembering the chaos and violence of the early camps with a mixture of distaste and something that might have been nostalgia. "But it turns out that being around desperate men who'll kill each other over a handful of gold dust isn't the best medicine for someone who's already lost faith in human nature." The understatement made Clara smile despite their circumstances, and Ezra found himself appreciating the way humor could create moments of connection even in the midst of danger and uncertainty. When was the last time he'd made someone smile? When was the last time someone had looked at him with genuine affection rather than wariness or calculation? "So you built your cabin and learned to live alone," Clara said, and there was understanding in her voice rather than judgment. "So I built my cabin and learned to live alone," Ezra agreed. "Or thought I had, anyway. Turns out there's a difference between choosing solitude and having it forced on you by circumstances beyond your control." They sat in comfortable silence. For a while, each lost in their own thoughts while the sounds of the cave system whispered around them. Somewhere in the distance, water ran over stone with the musical quality that spoke of underground streams carving their way through granite toward eventual freedom in the sunlight. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost sacred, as if they'd found sanctuary in the heart of the mountain itself. "Ezra," Clara said eventually, and there was something different in her voice, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "When this is over, when we've gotten away from Vincent's men and I'm safe somewhere they'll never find me, what happens then?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither was quite ready to examine directly. What had happened when the immediate crisis was resolved and they no longer had the urgent necessity of survival to focus their attention? Would they go their separate ways, grateful for each other's help, but ultimately returning to the solitary lives they'd been living before circumstance threw them together? "I don't know," Ezra admitted honestly. "I hadn't thought much beyond keeping you alive long enough to get you somewhere safe. But you must have thought about it at least a little," Clara pressed gently. "About what it would be like to go back to your mountain cabin after sharing it with someone else, about whether you'd miss having another person to talk to in the evenings." She was right, of course. He had been thinking about exactly those things, though he'd been trying not to examine the thoughts too closely. The prospect of returning to complete solitude after experiencing Clara's companionship felt strangely hollow, as if she'd reminded him of aspects of human connection he'd forgotten he valued. "Maybe I would miss it," he said carefully, testing the words to see how they felt. "Maybe I've been alone long enough to remember why people choose to share their lives with each other." It wasn't exactly a declaration, but Clara seemed to hear the possibility in his words, the suggestion that this partnership forged in desperation might have the potential to become something more lasting and meaningful. The idea should have terrified him, given how badly his previous attempt at building a life with someone had ended. But instead, he found himself cautiously hopeful about possibilities he'd convinced himself were no longer available to men like him. "I never thought I'd want to trust anyone again," Clara said quietly, echoing his own thoughts with startling accuracy. After Vincent, after seeing how easily men can lie and manipulate when they want something from you, I thought I'd spend the rest of my life keeping everyone at arm's length. "And now?" Ezra asked, though he suspected he already knew what. Her answer would be, "Now I'm sitting in a cave with a man I've known for less than 2 days, trusting him with my life and my secrets. And it feels like the most natural thing in the world," Clara said with a laugh that held more wonder than humor. "Either I'm a terrible judge of character, or you're different from the other men I've known." The comparison to other men in Clara's life, particularly to Vincent Blackwood, stirred something possessive and protective in Ezra's chest that surprised him with its intensity. He wanted to be different from those men, wanted to be worthy of the trust she was placing in him, wanted to prove that not all men saw women as objects to be acquired and controlled. "I'd like to be different," he said honestly. "I'd like to be the kind of man who deserves the trust you're giving me." "You already are," Clara said firmly, and the certainty in her voice made him look at her with surprise. A man like Vincent would have demanded explanations, would have insisted on knowing every detail of my story before deciding whether I was worth helping. A man like Vincent would have seen my desperation as an opportunity to negotiate for favors or payment. The casual way she spoke about such exploitation told Ezra more about her previous experiences than any detailed explanation could have managed. How many times had Clara encountered men who viewed her vulnerability as something to be taken advantage of rather than protected? How many times had she been forced to calculate the cost of accepting help from people who saw her primarily as a means to their own ends? "You never have to worry about that from me," Ezra said quietly, and he meant it completely. "Whatever happens between us, whatever we decide about the future, it will be because we both want it, not because either of us feels obligated or coerced." The relief that crossed Clara's face told him that his reassurance meant more to her than he'd realized. She'd been carrying the weight of constant wariness, always calculating whether the people around her could be trusted or whether they were simply better at hiding their selfish motivations than others. "Thank you," she said, and the simple words carried depths of gratitude that encompassed far more than just his promise about their relationship. "For everything. For saving my life. For protecting me. For treating me like a person rather than a problem to be solved or a prize to be won." Before Ezra could respond, the sound of voices echoed faintly through the passage they'd used to enter the cave system. The words weren't clear at this distance, but the tone was unmistakably that of men conducting a systematic search, calling to each other as they checked potential hiding places and escape routes. Both Clara and Ezra froze, hardly daring to breathe, as they strained to determine whether the voices were getting closer or moving away. The acoustic properties of the caves made it difficult to judge distance and direction, but the very fact that they could hear human voices at all meant that Vincent's tracking party had found the entrance to the underground passage system. "There in the caves," Clara whispered, and the fear in her voice was sharp enough to cut. "How is that possible? I thought you said this route was too dangerous for anyone who didn't know the way." "It is dangerous," Ezra said grimly, his mind racing through the implications of what they were hearing. "Which means either they're more desperate than I thought, or they know something about these caves that I don't." The possibility that Vincent Blackwood's resources included detailed knowledge of the local terrain was disturbing on multiple levels. It suggested not just that he'd been planning Clara's recapture for longer than they'd realized, but that he had access to information that should have been known only to longtime residents of the area. "What do we do?" Clara asked, and despite her fear, there was steel in her voice that told Ezra she was prepared to fight rather than submit to capture. "We go deeper," Ezra said, already gathering their supplies and preparing to move further into the cave system. "There are passages back there that lead to other exits, places where we can get back to the surface without having to go past whoever's following us." It wasn't an ideal solution, requiring them to navigate even more treacherous terrain while being pursued by men who were apparently more familiar with the underground routes than he'd expected. But it was better than being trapped in the cave system with no way out except through their pursuers. as they led their animals deeper into the mountain's heart. Following passages that grew narrower and more twisted with each turn, Ezra found himself thinking about the conversation they'd just had and the possibilities it had revealed. The crisis that had brought them together might also be the thing that destroyed any chance they had of exploring what lay between them, but somehow that only made him more determined to see both of them through to safety. Clara deserved the chance to discover what kind of life she could build when she was free from the fear and control that had shaped her recent experiences. And perhaps, if they survived what was coming, he deserved the chance to find out whether he was capable of building something lasting with someone who understood both his strengths and his wounds. The voices behind them were definitely getting closer now, and there was no more time for philosophical speculation about possible futures. They had immediate survival to worry about first, and everything else would have to wait until they'd found a way to emerge from the mountain into sunlight and safety. But as they made their way through passages that seemed to grow more complex with each turn, Ezra carried with him the memory of Clara's trust and the possibility that running away might finally be leading him towards something worth staying for. Part 4. The vulnerable moment and first care. The deeper passages of the cave system proved to be a labyrinth that challenged even Ezra's memory of his previous exploration. Side tunnels branched off in directions that seemed to lead nowhere, while the main route twisted back on itself in ways that made it nearly impossible to maintain any sense of direction or progress toward the surface. Clara's condition was deteriorating rapidly as they pushed forward through the increasingly difficult terrain. Her breathing had become shallow and rapid, and Ezra could see that she was having trouble staying upright even with the mule's steady gait to support her. The combination of her recent illness, the stress of constant flight, and the thin air of the underground passages was taking a toll that her weakened body couldn't sustain much longer. "I need to stop," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just for a few minutes. I can't." She didn't finish the sentence before sliding sideways from the mule's back, and only Ezra's quick reflexes prevented her from hitting the stone floor hard enough to cause serious injury. Even in the dim light that filtered down from somewhere high above, he could see that her face was alarmingly pale and her skin felt clammy to the touch. "Clara." He knelt beside her, checking her pulse and finding it rapid and thready in a way that spoke of someone whose body was shutting down from exhaustion and stress. "Clara, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, but they seemed to have trouble focusing on his face. "Sorry," she mumbled, the words slurred as if she were having difficulty forming it properly. "Didn't mean to be weak." "You're not weak," Ezra said firmly, though privately he was becoming seriously concerned about her condition. "You're exhausted and sick, and you've been pushing yourself far beyond what anyone should be expected to handle." The voices of their pursuers seemed to have faded somewhat, suggesting that the hunting party had either taken a wrong turn in the maze of passages or had decided to retreat and try a different route to the surface. Either way, it gave them a brief respite that Ezra intended to use to address Clara's immediate medical needs before they attempted to continue their escape. "Can you drink some water?" he asked, pulling his canteen from his pack and supporting Clara's head so she could sip without choking. She managed a few swallows before turning her head away, but even that small amount seemed to help clear some of the confusion from her eyes. "How much farther do we have to go?" she asked, and the plaintive quality of her voice reminded Ezra that beneath her remarkable courage and determination, Clara was still a young woman who'd been pushed far beyond her limits. "I'm not sure," he admitted honestly. "These passages don't follow the routes I remember from my previous exploration, and I think we may have taken a wrong turn somewhere back there." The possibility that they were lost in the cave system added a new dimension of danger to their already precarious situation. Even if they managed to avoid Vincent's tracking party, they could still die of exposure or dehydration if they couldn't find a way back to the surface within the next day or two. "Are you saying we're trapped?" Clara asked, and despite her weakened condition, there was more curiosity than panic in her voice. "I'm saying we need to be very careful about which direction we choose next," Ezra replied, though privately he was beginning to think that their options were becoming dangerously limited. There should be air currents that indicate passages leading to the surface, but it's hard to detect them when we're this deep underground. As if to mock his words, a faint breeze stirred the air around them, carrying with it the scent of pine and granite that spoke of the outside world. But the current seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once, making it impossible to determine which passage might lead to freedom and which might simply take them deeper into the mountain's heart. Clara struggled to sit up, despite Ezra's attempts to keep her lying down where she could rest more comfortably. "We can't stay here," she said with the kind of stubborn determination that had carried her through 2 weeks of desperate flight. "If Vincent's men find us like this, I won't be able to run or fight, and you'll be trapped trying to protect someone who's more liability than asset." "You're not a liability," Ezra said sharply, surprised by how angry her self-deprecation made him. "You're a partner, and partners look out for each other when one of them needs help." The word partner seemed to resonate with Clara in a way that gave her strength, allowing her to sit up more steadily and look around their current location with something approaching her usual alertness. They were in a chamber large enough to accommodate the animals comfortably, with several tunnel entrances leading off in different directions like spokes of a wheel. "Partner," she repeated thoughtfully, as if testing how the word felt. "I like that better than the woman you're helping or the fugitive you're protecting." There was something almost shy about the way she said it, as if the concept of true partnership was foreign enough to her experience that she wasn't entirely sure how to interpret it. How long had it been since anyone had treated Clara as an equal rather than as someone to be managed, protected, or controlled for her own supposed good? "That's what you are," Ezra said simply. "Someone I choose to work with because I trust your judgment and value your contributions, not someone I'm responsible for taking care of whether you want me to or not." The distinction seemed to mean more to Clara than he'd expected, bringing color back to her cheeks and strength back to her voice. "In that case, partner, what do you think about sending the animals down one passage while we take another? If Vincent's men are still following us, the hoofprints and scent trail might draw them away from our actual route." It was a tactically sound suggestion that showed Clara was thinking clearly despite her physical condition. More importantly, it demonstrated that she understood their situation well enough to contribute meaningful ideas about how to improve their chances of survival. "That could work," Ezra said, studying the available passages and trying to determine which would be most suitable for their purposes. "We'd need to choose routes that start in different directions but might eventually converge somewhere closer to the surface. What about that one?" Clara pointed toward a tunnel that seemed to slope gently upward, with air currents that suggested it might eventually lead to an exit. "It looks wide enough for the animals and has the kind of steady incline that would make for easier traveling." Ezra examined the passage she'd indicated, noting that the walls were smooth enough to suggest regular water flow during certain seasons, and the ceiling was high enough to accommodate riders without difficulty. It was exactly the kind of route that tired animals and their handlers would naturally choose, making it an ideal false trail. "Good eye," he said approvingly. "And we'll take that one." He indicated a narrower passage that seemed to branch off at an angle that would eventually bring them around to a different section of the mountain. "It's going to be harder going, but it should keep us away from anyone following the main trail." The plan required them to abandon their mounts and continue on foot, carrying only the most essential supplies while trusting that they could find their way to the surface before exhaustion or exposure became fatal threats. It was risky in ways that went beyond the immediate danger of pursuit, but it offered their best chance of escaping the cave system without being detected by Vincent's tracking party. As they prepared to separate from their animals, Clara insisted on taking a few minutes to write a note that she tucked into the mule's pack. "In case something happens to us," she explained when Ezra looked at her questioningly. "Someone should know what really occurred here, not just Vincent's version of events." The note was brief but comprehensive, explaining her identity, the circumstances that had led to her flight, and the true nature of Vincent Blackwood's character. It was the kind of precaution that spoke of someone who'd learned to think beyond immediate survival to the broader implications of her actions and choices. "What did you tell them?" Ezra asked as they watched the animals disappear into the passage that would hopefully draw their pursuers away from their actual route. "The truth," Clara said simply. "About Vincent, about the gold, about why I ran and what I was trying to protect. If we don't make it out of here, at least someone will know that we didn't just disappear without cause." There was something both practical and poignant about her desire to leave behind an accurate record of their struggle. Clara understood that their story might be told by others if they didn't survive to tell it themselves, and she wanted to ensure that the truth would be preserved even if Vincent Blackwood's wealth and influence allowed him to control the official narrative. The passage they'd chosen for their own escape proved to be every bit as challenging as Ezra had anticipated. The ceiling was low enough in places that they had to duck or crawl, while loose stones underfoot made every step treacherous in the near-complete darkness. But Clara gamely followed his lead, never complaining about the difficulties even when he could hear her breathing become labored from the exertion. "Talk to me," she said after they'd been traveling in silence for what felt like hours. "Tell me something about your life before you came to California, something that has nothing to do with loss or grief or running away." The request caught Ezra off guard, partly because he'd grown so accustomed to thinking of his past only in terms of what he'd lost that he'd almost forgotten there had been good times as well. But Clara was right to ask for something positive. They both needed reminders that life could contain joy and meaning as well as sorrow and struggle. "I used to build things," he said finally, thinking back to weekends spent in his workshop behind the house in Boston. "Furniture, mostly, and toys for Emma. There was something satisfying about taking raw wood and shaping it into something beautiful and useful." "What kind of toys?" Clara asked, and there was genuine interest in her voice rather than mere politeness. "A rocking horse was her favorite," Ezra said, surprised by how easily the memory came back to him. "Painted white with a real horsehair mane and a saddle I stitched myself from scraps of leather. She used to ride it for hours, making up elaborate adventures about brave knights and distant kingdoms." He could picture Emma so clearly in that moment, her dark hair flying as she rocked back and forth on her wooden horse, chattering away about imaginary quests and magical creatures. The memory brought pain, as such recollections always did, but it also brought something else, a warmth that spoke of love rather than loss. "She sounds wonderful," Clara said softly. "How old was she when?" "4," Ezra said simply, and Clara made a small sound of sympathy that told him she understood how young that was, how much potential had been lost along with his daughter's life. "I'm sorry," she said, and the words carried weight that spoke of someone who'd experienced her own share of profound losses. "Thank you for telling me about her." They continued through the passage in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts while they navigated the increasingly complex terrain. The air was definitely getting fresher as they climbed, suggesting that they were approaching some kind of opening to the surface, but the way forward remained treacherous enough that every step required careful attention. "Ezra," Clara said, suddenly, her voice carrying a note of strain that immediately put him on alert. "I think I need to rest again." He turned to find her leaning heavily against the passage wall, her face pale even in the dim light that filtered down from somewhere ahead of them. The combination of physical exertion and emotional stress was clearly taking a toll that her recovering body couldn't sustain much longer. "Of course," he said immediately, though privately he was concerned about how close they might be to collapse. "From exhaustion. Let's find a place where you can sit down properly." A few yards ahead, the passage opened into another small chamber where ancient water flow had carved smooth depressions in the rock that would serve as reasonably comfortable seating. Clara sank down onto one of these natural benches with obvious relief, while Ezra took the opportunity to assess their situation and plan their next moves. "How much farther do you think we have to go?" Clara asked, echoing his own concerns about their remaining endurance and the distance to safety. "Hard to say," Ezra admitted, though the increasing freshness of the air suggested they were much closer to the surface than they'd been in the deeper passages. "But I think we're making real progress. The air smells like pine and mountain granite, which means we're getting close to an opening." Clara nodded, but he could see that she was struggling to maintain the determined optimism that had carried her through the worst parts of their underground journey. Physical exhaustion was one thing, but the emotional toll of constant danger and uncertainty was something that even the strongest person could sustain for only so long. "Clara," he said gently, settling beside her on the smooth stone, "we're going to make it out of here. Both of us, together." "How can you be so certain?" she asked, and there was something almost desperate in her voice. "How can you know that this isn't just going to end with both of us dead in some cave where no one will ever find us?" The question revealed fears that went deeper than just their immediate physical danger. Clara was struggling with the broader uncertainty of whether all her efforts to escape Vincent Blackwood's control would ultimately prove futile, whether she was destined to lose everything she'd fought to protect simply because the forces arrayed against her were too powerful to overcome. Because, Ezra said firmly, taking her hand in his and feeling the way her fingers trembled with exhaustion and stress. I've learned something important since I found you collapsed by my creek. What's that? Clara asked, though her voice suggested she desperately wanted to believe whatever he was about to tell her. I've learned that some things are worth fighting for no matter how impossible the odds seem, Ezra said, and he meant every word completely. Your freedom, your safety, your right to choose your own path in life. These aren't just abstract principles to me anymore. They're personal. The intensity in his voice seemed to surprise Clara, as if she hadn't realized how deeply her situation had affected him or how committed he'd become to seeing her safely through to whatever lay beyond their current crisis. When was the last time someone had been willing to risk everything for her welfare without expecting anything in return? Personal, she repeated thoughtfully, and there was something almost wondering in her voice. Yes, I suppose it has become personal, hasn't it? Before Ezra could respond, she leaned forward and kissed him, a soft press of lips that spoke of gratitude and affection and something deeper that neither of them was quite ready to name. It was brief, hardly more than a moment of connection, but it changed everything between them in ways that would reshape whatever came next. When they separated, both were breathing a little harder, and the air between them seemed charged with possibilities that went far beyond mere survival and mutual protection. They were no longer just two people who'd been thrown together by circumstance, but partners who'd chosen to face whatever came next as a team. Now I know we're going to make it, Clara said with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since their flight began. Because I have something to look forward to on the other side of all this danger and uncertainty. The promise in her words gave Ezra strength he hadn't known he possessed, reminding him that survival was only the beginning of what they might build together if they were brave enough to trust what was growing between them. As they prepared to continue their journey toward the surface and whatever lay beyond, he carried with him the knowledge that running away had finally brought him toward something worth staying for. Part 4. Final, Awakening and Trust Formation. The passage upward proved to be their salvation, opening finally onto a narrow ledge that overlooked a valley Ezra didn't immediately recognize. The afternoon sun felt like a benediction after the oppressive darkness of the cave system, warming their faces and filling their lungs with air that carried the scent of wildflowers and pine resin instead of damp stone and underground streams. Clara emerged from the cave entrance behind him, blinking against the brightness like someone who'd forgotten what natural light looked like. Her face was streaked with dirt and exhaustion, her clothes torn and stained from their underground ordeal. But there was something different in her posture now, a strength that hadn't been there before their shared journey through the mountains. Heart, where are we? She asked, scanning the unfamiliar landscape with the careful attention of someone who'd learned never to take safety for granted. Ezra studied the configuration of peaks and valleys, comparing what he could see with his mental map of the region until he was able to orient himself. About 8 miles southwest of my cabin, he said finally. This valley connects with the main trail to Sacramento, but by a route that would take Vincent's men at least 2 days to find even if they knew where to look. The realization that they'd successfully evaded pursuit brought visible relief to Clara's features, though he could see she was still too experienced with danger to fully relax until they'd put considerably more distance between themselves and their enemies. 2 weeks of constant flight had taught her that safety was always temporary, always subject to change without warning. Do you think they're still following us? She asked, settling gratefully on a sun-warmed boulder while keeping her eyes on the passage they'd just exited. Probably, Ezra admitted, though he felt more confident about their prospects now that they'd reached the surface with a significant head start. But they'll have to backtrack to the original entrance and find another way around the mountain. By the time they reach this area, we'll be long gone. The prospect of continued travel clearly exhausted Clara, but she nodded with the resignation of someone who understood that survival sometimes required pushing beyond what felt possible. How many times over the past weeks had she forced herself to keep moving when every instinct screamed for rest and safety? "Where do we go from here?" she asked, and there was trust in her voice that told Ezra she was prepared to follow his lead whatever direction he chose. "There's a settlement about 15 miles north of here," he said, pointing toward a gap in the distant hills where smoke from cooking fires was barely visible against the afternoon sky. "Nothing fancy, just a trading post and a few houses, but they'll have supplies and fresh horses if we need them." Clara followed his gaze toward the distant settlement, and he could almost see her calculating distances and timing, estimating how long it would take them to reach potential safety, while weighing the risks of exposing themselves to strangers who might ask awkward questions about their circumstances. "Will they help us?" she asked. "Or are they the kind of people who might turn us over to Vincent's men if the price was right?" It was a practical question that showed Clara had learned to think like someone whose survival depended on accurately assessing the motivations and loyalties of everyone she encountered. The frontier was full of people who'd sell information or betray trust for enough gold, and a woman carrying $3,000 in coins had to be constantly alert to such possibilities. "Jack Morrison runs the trading post," Ezra said, thinking about the grizzled mountain man who'd built his business on a reputation for absolute discretion regarding his customers' affairs. "He's helped other folks who needed to disappear for various reasons. Won't ask questions and won't volunteer information to anyone who comes looking." The mention of other people who'd needed to disappear seemed to resonate with Clara in a way that brought both relief and a kind of melancholy recognition. She wasn't the first person to flee from powerful enemies, and she wouldn't be the last, but at least she didn't have to face her challenges completely alone. "What kind of help did he provide?" Clara asked, and Ezra could hear in her voice the careful hope of someone who'd learned not to expect too much, but couldn't entirely suppress the desire for genuine assistance. "New papers mostly," Ezra said, lowering his voice even though they were alone on the mountainside with no possibility of being overheard. "Documentation that would let someone start over with a new identity in a place where their old troubles couldn't follow them." The possibility of complete reinvention clearly appealed to Clara, though he could see her weighing the implications of such a drastic step. Becoming someone else entirely meant leaving behind not just her problems, but everything about her previous life, including connections and memories that might be worth preserving despite the pain they carried. "How much would something like that cost?" she asked, her hand moving instinctively to the bag of gold coins that represented both her inheritance and her insurance against an uncertain future. "For Jack, probably not as much as you'd expect," Ezra said, remembering the mountain man's peculiar sense of ethics when it came to helping people escape from circumstances beyond their control. "He's got his own reasons for disliking men who use wealth and influence to hurt folks who can't protect themselves." There was clearly a story behind Jack Morrison's motivations, but Ezra didn't elaborate, respecting the privacy that mountain people traditionally maintained about each other's backgrounds. Everyone who ended up in the wilderness was running from something, and the unwritten code demanded that you didn't pry into matters that weren't your business. As they prepared to begin the long walk toward the trading post, Clara suddenly reached out and caught Ezra's arm, her grip urgent enough to make him stop and look at her with concern. There was something in her expression that suggested she was struggling with a decision that went beyond immediate tactical considerations. "Ezra," she said carefully, as if testing how the words would sound before committing to them completely. "When we reach Jack Morrison's place, when I can get new papers and a fresh start somewhere Vincent will never find me, what happens to us?" The question hung in the mountain air between them, weighted with implications that went far beyond logistics and planning. During their shared ordeal in the caves, something had shifted between them, creating a connection that transcended the practical partnership they'd formed for mutual survival. But what did such a connection mean when their immediate crisis was resolved? "What do you want to happen?" Ezra asked quietly, though he suspected her answer might reveal things about his own feelings that he wasn't entirely prepared to confront. "I want," Clara began, then stopped and started again with more certainty. "I want to find out what it would be like to build something together when we're not constantly running from danger or hiding from enemies. I want to discover who we might be to each other when survival isn't the only thing holding us together." The honesty of her answer took Ezra's breath away, revealing hopes and desires that mirrored his own unspoken thoughts about possibilities that lay beyond their current circumstances. When was the last time someone had looked at him and seen potential for partnership rather than just temporary assistance or protection? You're talking about a completely different kind of life, he said, though his tone suggested consideration rather than rejection. Starting over in a place where neither of us has history or connections, building something from nothing with only each other to depend on. Is that so different from what you were already doing? Clara asked with a slight smile that took any sting out of the observation. Living alone in the mountains, depending on no one, answerable to no one but yourself? She was right, of course. The isolated existence he'd built for himself in the Sierra Nevada had been a form of starting over, an attempt to create meaning and purpose in a life that had been shattered by losses beyond his control. The main difference was that she was offering him the chance to build something with another person rather than in solitude. No, he said slowly, thinking through the implications of what she was suggesting. I suppose it's not that different. Except for the part about not being alone. Except for the part about not being alone, Clara agreed, and there was something both vulnerable and hopeful in her voice. If that's something you think you might want. The careful phrasing told Ezra that she was offering him a choice without pressure, making it clear that she would understand and accept whatever decision he made about their future. After spending weeks with Vincent Blackwood, who'd viewed her preferences as irrelevant to his plans, the experience of being given genuine agency in such an important decision must have felt both precious and unfamiliar. Clara, he said gently, taking her hand in his and noting how much steadier her grip had become since their first meeting. I haven't touched a woman since 1850, haven't allowed myself to imagine that I might be capable of building a life with someone else. Again, the admission seemed to surprise her, though whether because of the specific time frame or the broader implications, he couldn't tell. What happened in 1850? She asked softly. That's when Sarah and Emma died, Ezra said simply. That's when I decided that loving people was too dangerous, that caring about someone enough to build a future with them was just setting myself up for the kind of loss I couldn't survive twice. Clara was quiet for a moment, processing not just his words, but the weight of fear and self-protection they revealed. How many people had she known who'd closed themselves off from connection because the risk of loss seemed greater than the possibility of joy? And now, she asked, though her voice suggested she already suspected what his answer might be. Now I'm discovering that some things are worth the risk, Ezra said, and he meant it completely. You're worth the risk. The kiss that followed was different from their first tentative connection in the cave, deeper and more certain, flavored with decision rather than just comfort or gratitude. When they separated, both were breathing hard, and there was a new quality to the silence between them, an understanding that they'd committed to something that would reshape both their futures. So we do this together, Clara said, and it wasn't quite a question. We do this together, Ezra confirmed. New names, new papers, new life somewhere that Vincent Blackwood will never think to look for us. The smile that spread across Clara's face transformed her features in a way that reminded Ezra of sunrise after a long night, bringing warmth and light to places that had been cold and dark for too long. When was the last time he'd seen someone look genuinely happy about the prospect of sharing their future with him? As they began the long walk toward Jack Morrison's trading post and the new identities that would allow them to disappear completely from their old lives, Ezra found himself thinking about the strange turns that had brought them to this point. 3 days ago, he'd been a solitary man convinced that isolation was the only safe way to live. Now he was part of a partnership that promised adventures and challenges he couldn't have imagined. What kind of place do you think we should look for? Clara asked as they picked their way down the mountainside toward the valley floor. Somewhere with farming potential, or a town where we could start a business. The practical question sparked a conversation that carried them through the afternoon, as they discussed possibilities and preferences with the excitement of people who'd suddenly discovered they had choices about their future. Clara favored the idea of a small town where her education and his practical skills could be combined into some kind of useful enterprise, while Ezra leaned toward agricultural land where they could build something lasting with their own hands. We don't have to decide immediately, Clara pointed out reasonably. Jack Morrison will know about opportunities in different areas, places where new settlers are welcome and questions about backgrounds aren't too persistent. The prospect of such guidance was reassuring, suggesting that their transition from Fugitives to ordinary citizens might be less complicated than either had feared. But even more important was the growing ease of their conversation about shared plans, the way they'd begun thinking in terms of we and us rather than separate individual futures. By the time they reached the valley floor, the sun was beginning to set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise good fortune for whatever lay ahead. The trading post was still several hours away, but they were making good time on the easier terrain, and the prospect of rest and safety no longer seemed like an impossible dream. Ezra, Clara said as they followed a well-worn trail that showed signs of regular use by traders and travelers. "Thank you." "For what?" he asked, though he suspected he knew what she meant. "For seeing me as someone worth saving," Clara said simply. "For treating me like a partner instead of a burden or an obligation. For giving me a reason to believe that running away from Vincent was the beginning of something better rather than just the end of everything I'd known." The gratitude in her voice touched something deep in Ezra's chest, reminding him that their partnership had been as much about his salvation as hers. She'd given him a reason to engage with life again, to believe that his future could hold more than just survival and solitude. "Thank you for letting me help," he said quietly. "For trusting me with your safety and your secrets. For showing me that I was still capable of caring about someone else's welfare more than my own comfort." As they walked through the gathering dusk toward whatever new life awaited them at Jack Morrison's trading post, both carried with them the knowledge that they'd found something precious in each other, something that made all the dangers and uncertainties they'd faced seem like a small price to pay for the partnership they were building. The stars were beginning to appear overhead when they finally saw the lights of the trading post in the distance, warm yellow rectangles that spoke of human community and the safety that came from being among people who understood the value of discretion and mutual aid. Whatever names they chose for their new identities, whatever destination they selected for their fresh start, they would face it together. And somewhere in the darkness behind them, the mountain caves that had tested their courage and forged their partnership stood empty and silent, keeping the secrets of two people who'd entered as strangers fleeing their separate tragedies and emerged as partners ready to build something lasting together. Clara reached for Ezra's hand as they approached the trading post, and he squeezed her fingers gently in response, both of them understanding that they were walking toward not just safety, but toward the beginning of whatever story they would write together in the years to come. The mountain man who hadn't touched a woman since 1850 had found his heart again, and the woman who'd fled into the wilderness to escape one man's control had discovered what it meant to choose her own partner freely. Together, they stepped into the circle of light surrounding Jack Morrison's trading post, ready to become whoever they needed to be to protect what they'd built between them. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but no longer frightening, because they would face it as two people who'd learned that some things were worth any risk, any sacrifice, any change required to keep them safe. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.